This is The Sweater with Kathleen Dames. Over our 12-episode season, I will share some of my best sweater knitting techniques with you while we knit a sweater together. Hello, my friends, and thank you for joining me today on The Sweater with Kathleen Dames, Season 4, Episode 3. Today we're going to be talking about swatches and needles and swatching and what you can do to make that process a little less painful and why it is important to swatch. I know a lot of people don't like swatching. I don't love swatching. Some people really love it and that's what they do, and that's great. I like to be knitting. I like to be making the thing and then I like to finish it. That's really where I am happiest. So when I decided to do the Enwreathed pullover, I decided that I would do a cowl as a swatch because it's worked in the round. It's bigger than a traditional swatch, and with color work I found when I was working smaller circumferences and doing 2-color stranded knitting, I would pull really tightly and my gauge would be off on my swatch. And swatches don't always tell the truth. In fact, I may have been known to call them lying liars, but that doesn't mean that you can't, I'm going to set you up for success with doing the cowl first because it's at the more relaxed gauge where you will be working as, for the whole yoke of a sweater. It's a lot different than, say, your sleeve. That being said, I do love knitting a sleeve, and that's why I often prefer working bottom up, because I can knit a sleeve, I get a ton of information from that sleeve, and then I have one sleeve out of the way, so I only have a second one to do. But I had set myself this challenge of working top down to do the Enwreathed pullover. So I needed to figure out another way to swatch, to do as accurate a swatch as I could, and not feel like I'm wasting time. Now that being said, I did swatch for the new sweater I'm designing, the thing I'm knitting now while I'm talking to you, while you're knitting Enwreathed. And I did, my first swatch was a flat swatch, and I just wanted to find my plain stockinette gauge. So I started down here, I want to say this was like a US 4, and it's nice, it's fairly cohesive, but I felt like I wanted a sort of more cohesive fabric. So I see there's a little purl ridge here. It's actually, I knit on the wrong side because I'm working back and forth. And then I switched to a US 2 needle, and I like this fabric better. It is more cohesive. It's more what I was looking for this sweater, for the next sweater that I'm making. And that's something you need to know, or you need to figure out what you are looking for in your sweater. And we talked about that a little last time with talking about the yarn. The yarn is the foundation of what you're going to make. And then how you treat that yarn by choosing your needle size and all that will determine the fabric you'll get and the sweater you'll ultimately get. So it is important, and it gives you a lot of information. But as I said, we're we're concerned about the color work, and we want to make sure the yoke is going to fit, and so we need to swatch in color work. We can't just do, and this is a flat swatch. This is, in my experience, this is fine for stitch gauge, but your row gauge may vary more depending on how you work in the round. For some people, they've got a gauge that just matches stitch, knit side and knit stitches and purl stitches. But then, sometimes it depends on how you form knit stitches. And if you're doing knit stitches around and around and around, that can be different than if you form purl stitches such that they're bigger. That's often called rowing out. And you may discover that there are bigger spaces every couple rows if you're working back and forth. And so then if you're only doing knit, if you're working in the round and just knitting around and around and around, you won't have that, and your row gauge will be different. So if that is something that happens, if you know that you're the kind of person who rows out and you're working back and forth, you can try using a different needle size, usually a smaller, on your purl rows. So that is definitely something to think about. But of course, these projects are actually knit completely, almost completely in the round. We do a little back and forth at the very beginning to raise the back of the neck a little. But anyway, back to swatching, because that's what we're talking about today. So this is my second swatch. And in previous seasons, my second swatch would usually be a sleeve. But of course, since we're working top down, we won't get to the sleeves until later. And I did consider knitting a sleeve. I guess I would have knit it bottom up. It wouldn't really matter because the sleeve is just stockinette in one color. The color work stops short of the split join point. So I could have knit a sleeve bottom up or top down, and if I'd provisionally cast on, and then I could have grafted those stitches all the way around. That seemed like a lot of work, and I know a lot of people like top down because they don't have to do Kitchener stitch. Now, Kitchener stitch is not hard. It's one of those things you just have to remember how to do it. It's similar but not the same activities back and forth to weave those stitches together. I love Kitchener stitch. I can do a lot of Kitchener stitch. I can work to make it even, but in this instance, it just, that seemed like it was creating more work for me, and it wasn't giving me the information that I would need, which is the stuff up top. Because I've got a good idea of what my stockinette gauge is. And then I've got a good idea of what my colorwork gauge is now, having done this cowl. And you can see my floats. I'll turn it inside out. I'm going to talk more in a future episode about two-color knitting specifically. But I will say that at a bigger circumference, it's harder to pull tight, or you can more easily do relaxed knitting and get an accurate gauge swatch. So that is that's really why I decided to write the cowl pattern as well. And so I thought it was somewhere in there, but I don't think it is. The cowl is somewhere tucked away. It's probably been keeping me warm on other days. So I don't have it out here now. But the cowl, it's a nice circumference. This one for the new pattern is a little snug. It certainly would make a good hat as well. And that's another option. You know, Elizabeth Zimmerman, see, there you go. All I'd need to do is to decrease at one end to tighten it up. So I think for the pattern, I may give a second suggestion of doing probably 1 or 2 more repeats of the color work, the hearts, which is the largest. It's a 12 stitch repeat. So I'd add 12 or 24 stitches, and that would just give you a little more room. Although I have to say I like a cowl that's kind of cozy up against my neck sometimes. Sometimes you want a bigger one that can be a little more floppy and drapey and dramatic. But sometimes you just need to keep warm. And so like an extra turtleneck is not a bad thing. So this is my swatch. Remember that color work isn't as stretchy as stockinette. So that is why we really need to know what our gauge is here. And we want to be fairly accurate on stitch gauge so that we can be sure that the yoke is going to fit nicely. It's not as stretchy. When you're doing just stockinette, you have a little more wiggle room in terms of fit. You know, you can stretch things out a little, pull them, be gentle, don't stretch too hard. But so that's some about swatching, and I hung up my little notions pouch here. This is a from One More Row Press, which is my publishing house. It says knit like a local, and I love that it has the handle, and I really do. I use it all the time. It's the little one. I have a bigger pouch that I have all of my tools in, but this tool fits luckily right in there. And this one is a Susan Bates, and it's called a Knit Check, C-H-E-K. It's also a needle sizer, but I really like the measurements. I like to be able to use this. Somehow for me, the metal, I know it's not going to stretch. I have a tape measure that I love, but tape measures, they are a fabric essentially, and they can stretch a little, especially with a lot of wear. So I like the metal. I like the little window here. It's only a 2-inch window. I do recommend measuring over 4 inches, and this is 5 inches long, so you can get your 4 inches there. And really being honest. We've talked about honesty before. We talked about honesty in choosing our size. You really need to be honest with yourself how many stitches you measure across. It really is important. I'm showing this to you, holding it up. That is not the way to do it. Lay it flat on a smooth surface, pat it out. Do this after you've blocked your swatch the same way you plan to take care of your sweater. So I'm using non-superwash wools here. So, you know, gentle, tepid water, wool wash, letting it soak, letting the fibers absorb all that water, and then squeezing them out after they've had their lovely comfy bath and laying it out flat to dry and leaving it alone until it's fully dry, like at least overnight, depending on your weather conditions. It could take a day, it could take 2, because remember this is, this is stranded, so there are 2 strands of wool, so it's going to take a bit. And if you're laying it flat, then you've got 4 layers of wool. But you want to measure your gauge accurately. And generally, I write my patterns so that if you get stitch gauge, you're good, because I try to give all of the other information in terms of inches or centimeters, in terms of length rather than in terms of rows. Where it's in rows, it doesn't make as much of a difference. And even if I give some instruction, like, let's say on the sleeve decreases, where you do a decrease and then you work, I'll say 6 rows even, and then you do another decrease. Well, if you look at the gauge, maybe that it was 28 rows over 4 inches, so that's an inch. So every inch I'm doing a decrease, but it's easier to write the pattern in the other way in terms of rows. But you can tell right away that it is in terms of inches, and you can translate that in your head if you're getting a different row gauge, because usually you can match one. It's tough to really match both, especially if you're being honest. So I guess that's another reason I like writing my patterns myself, because then I only have to match my gauge. So you may, it may be time to go off-road. I had a few testers who found that I designed the sleeve on Enwreathed to be fairly narrow, and the body is a little more oversized, more relaxed, but I wanted to balance that volume with a slimmer sleeve. For some people that didn't work because they have more muscular arms, or they just have bigger arms overall. We're all different. So I talked them through a little bit about altering the rate of decrease. Either starting lower down, if the problem is if you have bigger upper arms or you want more room on the upper arm, then you could wait, work a little more even, and then do the decreases more rapidly to get you down to where you need to be. I'm sure there's an instance where it could be the other way around, where you have skinny arms and you want it really tight, and then you may decrease rapidly right away. So, but I'm getting off of the gauge thing here. So gauge, and what was I going to say? I was going to go back to saying that gauge swatches are lying liars. I had someone write in during the last season talking about, like, what can I do? I swatched with one needle and then I decided to go down to match gauge better. And then when I actually was knitting, I discovered that I should have gone with the first needle size. And it's, unfortunately, for the most part, we can do everything right. We can swatch, we can change needle size, we can treat our swatches the same way we're going to treat our sweaters. We can be patient and let them dry, and it still can be messed up. And the thing is, as you go along and as you knit more and as you get more confident and more relaxed too, you will probably settle into your swatch more accurately representing your finished product. That's sort of the case with me, although I have had instances where it's just, the gauge lied, the swatch lied. The thing is, knitting is fungible, and you can't always be certain that it's going to be accurate, because it is a different thing. This with I gotta put this down. This cowl is a good representation, but it's not a perfect representation because it is smaller. It's about a quarter, a third the size of your yoke. It can't be exactly the same. And there's just no, I'm sorry, there's no getting around that. The good thing is that unlike with sewing, with knitting, you can pull it out and try again, unless you've steeped it. And then of course, obviously you've cut the fabric. But you can pull knitting out and redo it, or you can make adjustments as you go. You could discover that, it's tighter up here. So then you may want to add a little bit more, or you may want to just pull back one, and it's okay if it's tighter up closer to your head unless it's too tight. And you may want to shift and increase enough more stitches. You may want to increase stitches to add an additional repeat for the next round. Knitting is flexible, so if you were adding, say, 10 more stitches to do the second set of pine boughs, that wouldn't necessarily be a problem. Now, when you add a lot more stitches, it can sort of flare, but I don't think that would be an issue here. So that's kind of what I have to say about swatches. I'm sure I can say a lot more, but I also want to say that the other thing I wanted to talk about was needles. And generally, I have discovered that I really like working magic loop. So in my patterns, I will often just specify one needle, the needle size I needed to get gauge, and I use that needle for the whole project. And I do it magic loop, where you pull out the little ears to work on a smaller circumference with a big needle. I really like that because then I'm sure that I'm using the same size needle for all the parts, and it's harder for me to lose something. It's harder for a DPN to slip out because there are no DPNs. That being said, a lot of other patterns will specify that you need a 16 inch for the neck, and then you need a 24 inch, and then you need a 40 inch, and then you need DPNs. And I want to say that you don't need to follow that. You need to figure out the way you like to make smaller circumferences. It might be, 8-inch double pointed needles. And those are great for a neckline. You can definitely do a sleeve with that. And then maybe transition to a 29-inch circular for the body, to keep stitches comfortably and safely on your needle. But, you need to figure out what works for you. Some people like working small circumferences on 2 circulars. So when a pattern tells you that you need 4 different kinds of needles, take a moment, think about it, and realize that that isn't necessarily the case. So that's just, I wanted to let you know that. But you will need whatever works for you. So, if you like DPNs, then do DPNs, swatch this on DPNs. Like I said, I like to get a 40 or 60 inch circular needle. I find that's really useful, and then I can pull out the sides, the loops, and do it a small circumference with just the one needle. So that is my advice for you, but you need to figure out what works for you in terms of needle length and style. Also, going along with that, you want to figure out what material works for you. For a long time, I really liked working on a lightweight plastic needle. Bryspun makes these great needles, and they have this sort of convex, is that right? Convex points. They're a little scooped. And I really liked working with those, although as I have gotten more advanced, I have discovered that I really prefer a metal needle. I can go faster, but know that the kind of needle you use will affect your gauge. And I've talked about this in previous seasons, that plastic versus wood versus metal versus glass, they all are going to give a slightly different gauge because they've got a different relationship to the yarn. Wood and bamboo tend to be a little more grippy, and so you may find yourself making your stitches smaller or making them bigger, but it is going to affect. So if you swatch with one and then you plan to knit with another, it's going to be a little different. I mean, it may be within the realm of fudging and it's not a problem, but you should know that if you're if you're newer to the knitting process, especially sweater knitting, it helps to know that that's the way things go with needle choice. Okay, so I think that's everything for today. That's my random thoughts on swatching and needles. Be sure to write in with any questions you have. You can leave a comment here if you're watching this on YouTube. If you're listening, probably the easiest thing to do is to be subscribed to my newsletter and hit reply on any of those messages. They all come back to me because I'm getting ready for the live show, and that'll be episode 5, where it'll kind of be a call-in format, but not everybody will be able to watch while I'm doing it live on YouTube. So if you have a question, feel free to ask me, and I will have a little stack of questions that I will discuss on the air in that episode. And it can be about swatching, it can be about color work, it can be about anything about sweater knitting, knitting in general. I love to talk about knitting. So those usually last like an hour, and they're a lot of fun, and if your question gets on the air, then you'll get an answer, I promise. If you haven't subscribed to the newsletter, you can do that by going to kathleendames.com/thesweater, and there's a newsletter sign up on there. And I am wearing, I thought I'd mention before we go, this is La Dame de Fer from I Knit Paris, that was in our second book, One More Row Press. And it's out now and available. And this is top down with a slip stitch yoke. I really am happy that I have the samples here for a little while longer, so I get to try them on and appreciate them in all of their Parisian glory. And you can get that book at One More Row Press. You can also get the pattern individually from the designer by visiting the I Knit Paris Ravelry page, and then you can navigate to La Dame de Fer from there. If you don't want the whole book, but the whole book is great. Anyway, I think that's it for today. Remember, if you have questions, let me know. If you are enjoying this podcast, please be sure to rate and review on iTunes. Even if you listen or watch somewhere else, those ratings really help over on iTunes, because it's sort of the 600-pound gorilla, right? Anyway, I hope that things are going well with you with your knitting, and that you've got your yarn, and now you can figure out your needles and do your swatches. And next time we'll be talking about, I think, things like casting on and two-handed color work. I think that is what we've got planned for episode 4. So that can so you can really get going on your sweater. So thanks so much for being here, and happy knitting. Mwah! Bye! This is season 4 of The Sweater with Kathleen Dames, and we are knitting the Enwreathed pullover together. Many thanks to B. Chez Bouche, Swans Island, and Monostel Uruguay for making such delicious yarns, and to Brooklyn General, Knitty City, and Swans Island Company for selling those yarns to me. Many thanks to my technical editor, my test knitter, and to you for being part of The Sweater with Kathleen Dames. To purchase the Enwreathed pullover and or cowl pattern, visit kathleensdames.com/thesweater or find it on Ravelry. Remember that you get a copy of the cowl pattern if you purchase the pullover. While you're there, be sure to sign up for my newsletter so you won't miss an episode. Plus, you can always hit reply on a newsletter and ask me any questions that come up about sweater knitting. Posting your progress on social media? Be sure to use the hashtags Enwreathed Pullover and Enwreathed Cowl and tag me at Kathleen Dames. If you have a chance, be sure to rate and review on iTunes, even if you watch the YouTube version of this podcast. Thanks so much for being here, and happy knitting.